We're so glad you are able to join. My name is Dr. Diana Fishbein. I'm the Director of Translational Neuroprevention Research at the University of Carolina's Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute. And I'm also the founder and co-director of the National Prevention Science Coalition to Improve Lives, which I will talk about in a few minutes again. This briefing will focus on the significant body of evidence that has been amassed in the field of neuroscience that has established the impacts of toxic stress on child brain development and, in effect, their ability to thrive and achieve well-being across the lifespan. Adverse childhood experiences are include a myriad of factors such as poverty and structural racism and trauma, witnessing violence and other adversities. And they are the common denominator in pathways to a wide range of academic, mental, and physical health problems. And then on top of that, the disparate effects of the pandemic on groups that were already vulnerable and that demand our attention at the policy level. Importantly, research has consistently shown that comprehensive, evidence-based preventive interventions and policies have been shown to reduce not only the detrimental impacts of adverse childhood experiences, but they also have the potential to actually reduce the exposure to what we call ACEs and toxic stress in the first place. So this briefing will be underscoring the role of policy in protecting children from adversity and promoting their healthy development. So as I said, we are the National Prevention Science Coalition to Improve Lives. And our mission is here on this slide. Basically, we are a large group of professionals from across a number of different disciplines that are devoted to translating science to policy, so we can be sure that the research that has been amassed over the past 30 years can have an impact on policy and, in effect, our quality of life. If you see below our URL, you can go to this website, and to get involved, go to the Get Involved page on our website. So our briefing is sponsored by the University of North Carolina Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute, and also RTI International, both in the Research Triangle of North Carolina. And we thank you both for your sponsorship. We also have two representatives who are sponsoring this video. This briefing. Unfortunately, neither of them were able to make remarks in person because there is a very vital vote today in Congress, in the House of Representatives at noon. And so they were unable to join this briefing. But they have sent videos to talk about the importance of this topic in their own legislative agendas. So I'm going to stop sharing, and first I'm going to introduce Representative DeLauro, and then I'm going to start sharing and show her video. So if you will, she is Congresswoman from Connecticut's 3rd Congressional District. She serves as the chair of the House Appropriations Committee and sits on the Democratic Steering and Policy Committee. And she is also chair of Labor, Health, and Human Services and the Education Appropriations Subcommittee, where she oversees our nation's investments in education, health, and employment. At the core of her work is her fight for America's working families to ensure everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed. She believes our first priority should be to strengthen the economy and create good middle-class jobs. She supported the child tax credit to provide tax relief to millions of families. And she introduced the Young Child Tax Credit to give families with young children an economic lift. She works to expand federal support for child nutrition and for modernizing our food safety system. She is determined to increase support for education and make college more affordable for more American students and their families. She also fights to protect the Affordable Care Act so that all Americans have access to affordable care. She strongly believes in the power of biomedical research, and she is working to increase funding so we can make life-saving breakthroughs in science and medicine. And last but not least, she believes we have a moral obligation to our nation's veterans and their families, including legislation to attend to their physical and mental well-being. Now I will stop my share and we will show her video.
Hello, this is Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, representing Connecticut's 3rd Congressional District. I am honored to join you today. Thank you to the National Prevention Science Coalition and the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University for hosting this important discussion. I want to recognize Dr. Diana Fishbein, Director of the National Prevention Science Coalition to Improve Lives, for that warm introduction and for inviting me to speak today. I am also delighted to welcome Dr. Jack Shankov from the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University, who will be sharing his work on how our experiences shape brain development throughout childhood and adolescence. We understand now more than ever how critical the first few years of life are in the development of children and how it shapes the opportunities that children have throughout their lives. So if our country is to live by our professed values, our attention to children has to start with the first years of life. That is why 18 years ago, almost to the day, after I first introduced the expanded child tax credit, both the Senate and the House passed it as part of President Biden's COVID relief package. My work on the child tax credit is rooted in my desire to harness the power of the federal government to provide for the least among us. I believe that the government's role is to provide opportunities for people to work for the common good, and the federal government has a central role to play. Through nutrition, childcare, healthcare, the social safety net, or our tax code, this is about families and how we make their lives better and expand opportunity for their kids. The child tax credit is a historic opportunity to offer a lifeline to the middle class and cut child poverty nearly in half. That is why I have introduced legislation to expand and improve the child tax credit in each of the last 10 Congresses, because I knew that if we provide children and their families with additional payments throughout the year, this would help costs throughout the year, including food, childcare, diapers, healthcare, clothing, and more. Working, middle class, and poor families will feel more secure and better able to deal with regularly occurring expenses that have only become more burdensome with the spread of COVID-19. The expansion and improvement of the child tax credit that were included in the American Rescue Plan were groundbreaking and an important first step in the fight to make this expansion permanent. But it is not enough. Children and families must be able to count on this benefit long after the end of this pandemic. Today is a new dawn. The coronavirus has exposed serious, long-standing inequities, particularly as it relates to communities of color. But we have a real opportunity here to build the architecture for the future and use this as a moment to address these inequities and lift millions of children out of poverty. Thank you again for allowing me to join all of you at the National Prevention Science Coalition to Improve Lives and the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University, and contribute to this critical discussion. The more seriously we take early childhood education and behavioral health issues for struggling families, the stronger our communities will be and the more resilient our kids and our future will be.
Thank you so much, Representative DeLauro, for that really amazing introduction. and support for the topic of this congressional briefing. I want now to introduce Representative Jamal Bowman. He represents New York's 16th district. He was born and raised in New York City, spending his early years in public housing and rent-controlled apartments. He was raised by his mother, who supported them with their post office workers' salary. After graduating from the University of New Haven, Representative Bowman began his career as a crisis intervention teacher in a Bronx public school, and went on to earn a master's degree in guidance counseling from Mercy College and a doctorate in education from Manhattanville College. In 2009, Representative Bowman founded the Cornerstone Academy for Social Action, a Bronx middle school focused on unlocking the natural brilliance of all children through a holistic curriculum, where he served as principal for a decade. He worked to center students' voices, cultural awareness, and love, and to ensure advanced student involvement in science, technology, engineering, art, and math. Representative Bowman has also been an outspoken advocate for rethinking education, including ending state-sanctioned yearly standardized testing. Congressman Bowman was elected to Congress in 2020, running on a platform of transformative, progressive policies that will improve the lives of those who have been legislated out of the American dream. Congressman Bowman is dedicated to passing visionary policy that infuses climate justice with economic and racial justice, and to highlighting the importance of research and investing in communities of color. I'm going to now stop my share, and we will hear from him.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm thrilled to be a part of today's convening as we look back at a decade of science informing policy. I'd like to give a special thank you to today's hosts, the National Prevention Science Coalition to Improve Lives and the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University. Their diligent and groundbreaking efforts over the years helped change the way we talk when we talk about early childhood. That is no small feat. It wasn't too long ago that early childhood education was wrongly reduced to babysitting, and lawmakers believed we had to choose between quality or access, rather than recognizing access to quality as the only acceptable baseline's answer for our kids. Babies are born learners, and it is well established by brain science that a child's environment and interactions in the first 1,000 days of life, whether positive or negative, and long before they would enter a kindergarten classroom, are highly formative during this critical period for learning and growth. When those formative early childhood experiences include inadequate nutrition, homelessness, or other adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, such as those brought on by a global pandemic, we know that a child's brain and body are changed in ways that are linked to poor health and learning outcomes later in life. Without reliable supports in place to buffer our kids from the stress, that stress can quickly turn toxic. The good news is that ACEs are preventable on a national scale if we are collectively willing to put in the investment worthy of our kids. As a representative for New York's 16th District and a former educator and school leader, I believe our goal for healthy early childhood development needs to be more ambitious than the prevention of ACEs, which aims to protect our kids from the worst effects of stress and trauma. That should be the floor. We ourselves need to move past a scarcity framework and embrace a framework of shared abundance. That looks like affordable, reliable access to quality childcare where young children, in the context of an intergenerational community, are empowered to explore themselves and the world with pure wonder, where they grow into self-directed learners, collaborative leaders, and adaptive, community-centered problem solvers. But we are far from meeting that metric, which asks us to go beyond our current best practices as they're implemented today and to follow the research on what comes next. Our current investment in the patchwork system of federal, state, and local childcare funding have made a positive impact on many children over the years that were directly served. But that only represents a fraction of all children. It's necessary we do substantially more in terms of reach and scope. COVID-19's impact on families and communities made it clear we must advance a holistic, ambitious vision for healthy early childhood development that pulls us out of silos and builds towards an economy and society based on care for people, communities, and the planet we all share. I look forward to working with many of you convened today to turn that vision into research-informed legislation. Thank you. Peace and love to everyone.
And much, much thanks to Representative Bowman for that amazing, his sponsorship and his support for the work that we'll be talking about today. It is now my very, very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jack Shankov. He is the Julius Richmond FAMRI Professor of Child Health and Development at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and Harvard Graduate School of Education. He's professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School and Boston Children's Hospital, and research staff at Massachusetts General Hospital, and director of the university-wide Center on the Developing Child at Harvard. He currently chairs the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child, whose mission is to bring credible science to bear on public policy affecting children and families, and the JPB Research Network on Toxic Stress, which is developing new measures of stress effects and resilience in young children. Under the auspices of the National Academy of Sciences, Dr. Shonkoff served as chair of the board on children, youth, and families, and led a blue ribbon committee that produced the landmark report From Neurons to Neighborhoods, the Science of Early Childhood Development. He currently leads Frontiers of Innovation, a multi-sectoral, science-based research and development platform committed to achieving breakthrough outcomes at scale for young children and families facing adversity. Dr. Shonkoff has received numerous professional honors, including elected membership to the National Academy of Medicine, the C. Anderson Aldrich Award in Child Development from the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Distinguished Contributions to Social Policy Award from the Society for Research in Child Development, and the LEGO Prize. He has authored more than 150 publications and has been a visiting professor or delivered named lectureships at more than 35 universities in the United States and around the world. Please welcome Dr. Jack Shankov, a real maverick and a very important figure in this field.
That was an overly generous introduction, Danny. I wish you had shortened it so you don't kind of eat up my time here. Let me just...
Not at all, not at all.
My presentation now. Okay, can you all see this? Is it showing well?
Yes.
Right. So first, let me thank all of you for the opportunity to be here today. Thank Representatives DeLauro and Bowman for sponsoring this, and you, Denny. And I wish I were in the same room with all of you so I could see you as opposed to just talking to my screen. But anyway, I'm going to give you a kind of a whirlwind tour of where the science of early childhood development is right now, on top of what you all know. So I think we've already gotten a good introduction to the brain science story. I'm going to build on that and emphasize that my presentation right now is focusing on where the leading edges of 21st century science and how it can inform policies. I'm going to talk about its relevance for health as well as for early learning and how we might think about this post-COVID-19 world. So let me just kind of start with three lenses to think about investment in the early childhood period. Hang on a second, I really want to get these things off my screen. So first off, I think we all understand there's a sense of shared social responsibility for all of our children. It's really kind of the lifeblood of our society, but that's just 1/10. That's just one lens. Another lens, which has gotten a lot of attention over the last couple of decades, is that this isn't just, quote, the right thing to do, but this is a very smart investment in human capital. It returns a great deal, many more dollars in human capital return than what we spend for services. And what I'm going to talk about today is a third lens, which is there is a rapidly moving frontier of scientific research about in developmental biology that is untapped and that really represents where we could kind of expand our mindset about early childhood investments in a post-COVID-19 world. And that's what I'm going to talk about right now. So I'm assuming that I don't have to spend time with all of you telling you that early experiences shape brain development and excessive stress activation disrupts brain development. And the essence, the kind of active ingredient of what we mean by early experiences are the relationships that very young children have with the adults who care for them. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about, I'm going to kind of build on that and go to the next step and assume you all know that. So for starters, the frontiers of science, and by this I mean the biological as well as the social and behavioral and developmental sciences, are really moving our kind of a edge of understanding about the origins of disparities in learning, behavior, and health early in life. And there are three core concepts that I'm going to present to you now and move through them quickly and then go a little bit deeper into the biology. And I should say, for those of you who are not familiar with our work, my colleagues and I take a very conservative stance on science. So when we talk about science, it is not the kind of the study du jour. It is not, let me tell you about an interesting paper that came out last month. This is about what we know from literally decades of research and what everyone agrees on, not where the areas of kind of nuance and disagreement are. So here are three very powerful core concepts that are indisputable in the scientific community. The first, which in some ways is, I'm kind of putting this on the table as a call to action for the early childhood community, that all of the work that we have been doing together, both in building the science and applying it, that we put under the umbrella of the science of early brain development, is our starting point. And what a broader scientific lens is telling us is that, guess what? The brain is connected to the rest of the body. So that all of the work we know and the principles that we've been using to explain why early experiences affect brain development and early learning are the same influences that affect the development of the immune system, the development of metabolic regulatory systems. And the take-home message here is that early childhood experiences and adversity and investments are as much about lifelong health as they are about early learning and readiness to succeed in school. That's concept number one. Concept number two is the critical importance of the essential nature of variation in sensitivity to the environment. So we talk in broad terms about the impacts of poverty on child development, the impacts of structural inequities, particularly systemic racism on poverty, the impacts of violence, the impacts of mental health, maternal depression, all of which are real on a population level. Everything that you all know about that is true. But what science is telling us is that children vary tremendously in how sensitive they are to the environment. Before I get to the science, everybody who is a parent who has more than one child, anybody who's been a member of a family with more than one child, anybody who knows anybody who has more than one child, we all know that children in the same family with the same parents respond differently to the environment. Some are more sensitive, some are more kind of, they roll with the flow. So this basic issue of not being able to overgeneralize is critically important. And when we talk about response to the environment, we also have to recognize that policies and programs are part of the environment. A home visiting program is part of the environment. A center-based program is part of the environment. So the field has to kind of really embrace this core scientific principle and recognize we have to stop asking, what's the best program for children living in poverty? What's the best program to combat the effects of systemic racism? In the same way, we would never say, what's the best treatment for cancer? We'd say, what kind of cancer do you have, before I can answer that question. And so we really need to understand at a much deeper level about how we can develop policies and programs that provide what all children need for healthy development, and then recognize that there will be variability in terms of some needing more and some needing less. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. But the third concept here is the importance of timing and critical periods. So we know that there are things that happen early in development during what we call sensitive periods or critical periods that are most open to environmental influences. In the brain, it's when certain circuits are being built. That's the time they are most sensitive to environmental influences. And then when those circuits are built, the brain moves on to the next level of circuits. And those circuits that were just completed are done. And you can't go back and rewire. You can always try to make things better later, but you can't redo what wasn't done right the first time. And I'm going to say a few things about critical periods a little bit later in my remarks, but what we're learning now at the molecular level, in the brain, in the immune system, and other biological systems, that there are certain aspects of human development that happen during pregnancy, particularly related to nutrition and related to excessive stress. Need to be careful about talking about stress in pregnancy. I don't think there ever was a pregnant person who wasn't experiencing stress during pregnancy. So it's not that all stress is bad, but it's the timing. And there are certain aspects of the immune system and brain development that have a lot of their development most sensitive to influence in the first 1 to 2 years after birth. So without taking away at all from the importance of pre-K for 3 and 4-year-olds, there are some very important things that are happening much earlier that we have to start paying attention to, particularly for children facing the most adversity. So let me move on now and do a deeper dive. I'm going to take you deeper down now into the biology of adversity and resilience that explains how excessive stress can undermine the foundations of healthy development. And for starters, here's the framework to think about. These are the basic principles of developmental biology that are incontrovertible. Everything that we might want to know something about, whether it be learning, whether it be behavior, physical health, mental health, always the roots of competence, the roots of difficulties are a result of the interaction between individual genetic variation, environmental stressors, and timing. Where are you in the developmental process? When we talk about genetics, which can be a very kind of a disabling issue to talk about, we have to be really clear. The biology is incontrovertible. This has been settled as a biological issue since the Human Genome Project was completed. Genes do not operate automatically out of context. All genetic predispositions are basically just that. They are predispositions. They're not foregone conclusions. They are shaped by how the environment affects gene expression at different points in time. And there is no genetic basis for race whatsoever. Race, as defined, is a social construct defined by physical characteristics like the color of your skin and others, but your genes, your genetics, has nothing to do with these superficial characteristics of race. They have to do with thousands of years of ancestry. Is where do you come from in terms of where not just your parents and your grandparents, but generation after generation have much more to do from which part of the world and which populations did you come from, and has nothing to do with race or ethnicity or any of these other features that we use for social distinctions. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is take you inside the body and explain how the interaction between genetics and the environment and timing affects outcomes in learning and in health. So this is multiple systems involved. And I'm going to do a quick roundabout through the body. And this first round is to show you how the stress response is our friend. The stress response is what protects us and helps us deal with threat. I can't see any of you right now. I don't know most of you, but I know by virtue of the fact that you're here and listening, is you know what stress feels like. And the reason that Representatives DeLauro and Bowman couldn't be with us is because they are working in a very stressful environment under the best of times and the worst of times. People who deal with these kinds of challenges experience stress. And everyone here knows what we mean by the physical sensation of stress. So I want you to keep that in mind as I walk through this slide. I'm not talking about causes of stress. I'm talking about what is going on inside of our bodies when we are stressed. So let's quickly do a whirlwind tour through. When we are stressed, our stress hormone levels go up. Cortisol is the one that's best well known. What does that do? As it gets into our brain, it increases our ability to focus attention and be alert. It mobilizes energy stores throughout the body, increasing our blood sugar. It changes circulatory patterns. What it does is this is the beginning of the fight or flight response. Stress hormones are life-saving in a situation where we have to think fast, we have to run, we have to fight, we have to figure out what to do. It saves our lives in stressful situations, but it's not just about stress hormones. Our heart rate goes up, our blood pressure goes up to kind of bring energy stores all throughout the body. Bring more blood to the muscles if you've got to run, you've got to fight. Bring more to your brain if you've got to think quickly. The inflammatory system is activated. This is a basic response of our immune system. It's preparing. It's built this way. It's preparing to deal with wounds and potential infection. You all know what inflammation is. If you get a cut and you notice as it's shortly afterward, it gets red, it feels hot, you feel some pain. This is the inflammatory response of the immune system that is already working at trying to keep infection out and is already working to begin the healing process. These are all automatic. Metabolic regulation. Metabolic changes mobilize sugar all through our body for energy to kind of deal with the threat. This gets a little bit more esoteric, but this is kind of fancy language that says that not only are these systems affected, but at the molecular level, changes are happening, chemical changes that are turning genes on and turning genes off, again, in an acute situation. I'll come back to this in a second. And finally, brain circuitry and electrical activity is really activated, particularly around the fear circuits and the kind of rapid response circuits and focusing your attention. So let's start with an understanding that stress is a normal part of life. Protecting young children from any stress experience is not good. If you don't experience stress, you don't know how to deal with it. You don't develop resilience. The goal here is manageable amounts of stress. The normative stresses of everyday life, the stress of having to share your toys, the stress of not being allowed to eat 10 cookies, the stress of maybe the first day in a childcare center where you don't recognize anybody. These are good stresses to experience. This is how we learn to deal with stress. The key issue here is there are adults who are helping us to feel safe when we feel stressed as very young children and modeling adaptive skills. But now we get into the issues of where stress moves from being our friend to being potentially very disruptive of both learning behavior and of health. So I'll pick out a few. Stress hormones. Those stress hormones that help us kind of think more quickly, think more clearly, mobilize energy stores. They weren't meant to stay up all the time. They're meant to deal with the acute stress and then come back to baseline. And if they stay up all the time, it begins to have a wear and tear effect on the body. And particularly parts of the brain are very susceptible to excessive elevated stress hormones. The fear circuitry in the brain is sensitive to that. Some of the simple memory and learning circuits are sensitive. And then not surprisingly, circuits related to focusing your attention, regulating your emotions, regulating your behaviors. Those circuits, if they're overloaded with stress hormones, start to get disrupted, which is why chronic high levels of stress result in problems paying attention, regulating your behavior, and having a short hair trigger for having your fear responses be activated, which clearly interfere with early learning. Let's move to inflammation. So think about that inflammation on your skin when you have a cut. Obviously, there's something going on under the skin. There's a body's reaction to that. That's good. That's good for wound healing. That's good for protection against infection. But if that level of inflammation, which is going on inside of your body, continues, it has a serious kind of potentially damaging effect on many body organs. Inflammation is one of the processes that explain a lot of the most common chronic diseases. Chronic inflammation accelerates atherosclerosis. It increases the risk of you developing plaques and blockages in your coronary arteries, making you more likely to end up with heart disease. Inflammation is highly correlated with depression, kind of serious diagnosable major depression. The causes are not entirely clear, but it's been documented over and over again that adults with serious depression have elevated levels of inflammation. And the same is true for Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. So we know this is an example of where the frontiers of biology haven't figured this out, but we know that inflammation is a huge issue in many diseases, including arthritis, chronic lung disease, and some forms of cancer. Metabolic regulation. We need more energy stores to deal with threat. We need higher blood sugar. It needs to get to all parts of the body. But if it stays high and it doesn't come down all the time, then what happens is the insulin mechanism that helps get glucose into cells starts to get overloaded, and we develop something called insulin resistance that goes on to develop metabolic syndrome, that goes on to turn into obesity, that goes on to turn into diabetes. So again, without getting into a lot of details, these acute responses to stress, which are good for us, over time, if they don't diminish, have a wear and tear effect. It's a great thing. There was a state legislator we worked with one time who listened to all this and said, God, that sounds like an adrenal high 24/7. That can't be good for you. And somebody's grandmother once said, all of this stress activation can't be good for your health. We now have a scientific understanding of what common sense tells us, but the important thing is these things can start early. They can start early in life. These systems are all developing very early, many of them even before birth. So with that that's your crash course in the basic biology. The take-home message here is stress responses are good. Stress is an important part of normal life. Excessive stress activation, which can turn into what we call toxic stress, can be very threatening to learning, behavior, and health. But recognize again, remember, individual differences in sensitivity. So ACE scores, high levels of stress early on, are an indication of increased probability of problems. They're not a death sentence. It doesn't mean that everybody's experiencing this is going to end up with serious problems. And this is where the resilience issue comes in, which is building the capacity to deal with stress and bring that stress system down. So we talk about this a lot in the early childhood field. We build it into our programs that work directly with children and work with children and families. We recognize these kinds of coping skills and these protective behaviors are critical for caregiving. They're critical for people who work in early childhood programs, who work with parents and other caregivers and children. But there's another issue here, which has to do with structural inequities in our society. This is one set of data that has been replicated so many times. The upstream adversities that impose disproportionate stresses on families of color. These are kind of the structural factors that are associated with why racism, it's not about race, it's about racism that leads to significant disparities in outcome. We see there are significant disparities in financial hardship and financial security based on race and ethnicity. And some people might look at that and say, well, isn't that just a matter of income? And it is income, but it's not just income, it's wealth. And this is where we get into understanding the historical legacy of some of these inequities, because for most people, except the ultra rich, for most people, your wealth, which is not what your weekly or monthly paycheck is, but what you have to rely on to have some sense of financial security, that wealth for most people is tied to their home ownership and how much equity you have in your home. And so now you see the consequences of longstanding inequities in access to home ownership, redlining, availability of loans, the ability to buy a home in a neighborhood where the value of your home will increase significantly over time, which has a lot to do with your accumulation of wealth. So a lot of structural inequities that have been associated with differences in access to resources for people of color now appear in terms of financial hardship that's clearly tied to what kind of job you can get, which is tied to what kind of education you can get, which is tied to where you live in terms of differences in terms of how education systems are paid for, generally by local taxes, is still this significant disproportion. Same thing in terms of exposure to neighborhood violence. And when you tee up the list of multiple adversities, they're also unequally distributed, with a greater burden on communities of color. So what this is saying is, and I put this out as a challenge for all of us, is that for the early childhood system to make significant progress in reducing disparities, we can't put the burden just on early childhood programs. The science is telling us we need to understand that we have to go upstream to deal with many of these structural inequities that are part of what constitutes the increased stress and burden on families of color, even regardless of people's income, because it has a lot to do with the indignities and the stresses of everyday discrimination. So we've got a lot of work to do to expand our lens on what we mean by early childhood policies without in any way diminishing the importance of programs that work directly with children and with families. So on this slide, this is where I wish I could see some of you, because I always chuckle at how an audience reacts to this. So this is basically a conceptual graph of this notion of why early matters. And in fact, this is targeted to the brain. It says early life experiences, matter because the adaptability of the brain decreases over time. This is the plasticity curve. Whereas at birth, the plasticity, the adaptability, the ability of the brain to kind of have maximum capacity to adjust to circumstances at its greatest, it drops pretty rapidly in the early childhood years. It then continues to decrease, but not as dramatically. And the chuckle here is that I know all of you, before I ever started my first sentence, once you understand what this table is about, you went and looked at your own age to kind of see how am I doing, how bad off am I, or how well off am I? And the important part of this curve is that it doesn't go to zero, right? So this goes up to 80 years. The screen is only so wide. If there's someone in the audience who's 105 years old, who at the end of this presentation goes home thinking about any of what I've talked about, and wakes up the next morning and remembers anything from this, which would be true for most people, you've learned something, and your brain has made some new connections. It never ends until we have a flatline EEG and we die. So, but the point is that the cost, and now this is a biological concept, the physiological cost to the brain to modify its connections later in addressing the challenges that come up later in life, the cost is actually higher in energy. The brain needs more sugar, it needs more oxygen. It has to work harder if it's building on circuits that weren't sturdy from the beginning. And you could also see it's easy to translate that into the financial cost to society also goes up quite a bit as you get older. And there's a biological explanation for that. The everyday explanation is, why is it that every year on New Year's, we make the same resolutions to exercise more and eat better and lead a healthier life? The fact that we have so much trouble is not because we're not motivated. It's because it's really hard to reprogram the brain the older you are. And the same thing applies now. We need to understand to other biological systems, to the immune system, and to other biological processes. So now what I want to do, and I'm almost coming to a close because I really want to open up some time for some questions and discussion back and forth. So let's look at what can we learn from the COVID-19 experience? How could we look through the COVID-19 pandemic assault and have this help us think more about the origins and the roots, and therefore some of the solutions to dealing with inequalities that begin early in life. So there's a lot to say about this. I'm just going to put 3 thoughts out first to consider. The first is the dramatic disparities that we saw associated with poverty, racism, and other structural inequities. But that's not new. That was not a surprise. That just basically laid bare what's kind of always been a tremendous challenge facing our society. But the thing that we should be thinking more about from the COVID experience is it very dramatically pointed out the striking variations in susceptibility to illness in response to treatment, showing the differential impacts of adversity on health. So the first thing we think of is age. Age really mattered. Second, where you live really mattered. So people who are older, who lived in nursing homes, close together were more at risk than older people able to kind of sequester themselves in homes in the suburbs. And where people lived in terms of how densely populated their homes were, and whether they had the option of working from home, and how much they were in public-facing situations, all affect your current environment, all affected your susceptibility to the disease. And then there was the issue of the unequal rates of death and the greater death rates, even if you got the disease, whether you got better or not depended upon pre-existing medical conditions, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, hypertension. Those were all signals of greater risk. Why? Okay, and keep that in mind because of the next point. So the origins of disparities in health and educational achievement begin during pregnancy in the earliest years of life. And so if we look at those pre-existing conditions, not only were current living conditions a kind of obvious source of inequality in susceptibility to the disease, but obesity, heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, they have their origins starting very early in life. They don't begin with people not living healthy lifestyles. They begin with inflammation. They begin with metabolic changes early in life, sometimes as early as pregnancy. So the relative invisibility of infants incurs tremendous preventable costs down the road for us because many of these problems in adult life start early on. It's not just about graduating high school without taking away from the importance of education. It's obviously critical. So the third piece is, which is kind of really, I think, a message that the whole early childhood field understands, is that the health and well-being of young children is inextricably tied to health and well-being of the adults who care for them. So if we're going to kind of dramatically improve outcomes in learning, school readiness, and health, we have to understand that it's not magic, and governments don't raise children, even when government programs make a difference. Adults raise children, parents raise children, extended family, neighbors raise children, and they have to basically have their basic needs met before they can provide the kind of buffering and growth promoting environment for young children. So just a quick thing for those of you, I know many of you, who are always concerned, as we should be, about the return on investment. And we have been, for years now, we have focused on return on investment in terms of more people getting more education, being productive workers and paying taxes instead of being on public assistance. And the big enchilada was the cost of incarceration, which is very expensive and which early childhood programs have been shown to reduce. But actually, even the cost of incarceration pales next to the cost of the most expensive and most common diseases that are the big budget busters everywhere: cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and depression, just to name 3 of the top 5 causes of elevated healthcare costs. Look at how much money we spend. Think about what even a 1 or 2% decrease in these diseases based on what we do in early childhood would mean in terms of dollar savings. So the take-home message here is that science-informed investments that reduce trauma, hardships, and exposures, adversity, and effects of racism, and intergenerational poverty during pregnancy in the first 2-3 years after birth. We've got a lot of science more to figure that out, but all signs are pointing to those kinds of investments in this very early period hold the option for enormous savings in healthcare costs that we haven't even introduced into the equation of the return on investment. So I want to add, I want to kind of finish with this take-home message. How do we take all this complicated science? How do we turn it into kind of simple principles that could guide decisions about policies, decisions about programs across sectors: education, health, social welfare, child welfare, community development? All of this science boils down to 3 very simple basic principles that should guide all decisions we make. How are we supporting responsive relationships between the adults who care for very young children and those young children? Second is, what are we doing to reduce sources of stress that put enormous burdens on families that get translated into this excessive stress activation for many children. And it's not just the sources of stress that are within the family and within the community, but the big one that we haven't done enough to bring into the early childhood ecosystem are the sources of stress that come from macro level policies that differentially affect families experiencing intergenerational poverty and systemic racism and other structural inequities. And the third issue is, how are we strengthening core skills? Not just what are we teaching people about child development and what advice are we giving, but how are we strengthening the skills of the people who work in programs and the families and other caregivers who provide the home environment for children, about those core skills of being able to create a well-regulated, pretty predictable, day-to-day stable environment. And how do we build those? Those skills don't come in automatically. It's not like sitting and crawling and walking. They come in from learning with buffering, protection, and role modeling from the adults who care for you. And the beauty of this is that these skills can be developed later in life as well. They're not done and over. And the beauty of this is they're produced by coaching and practice, which is a non-deficit model. Elite athletes practice all the time, and they have coaches. So it's a coaching and practice model that we need, not just telling people what to do. So I'm going to stop right here. Actually, my last message on this slide is, obviously the devil is in the details. None of these three principles are new to everybody who's listening. This is kind of bread and butter for the field. But the real issue is, how do we do it? And getting back to some of these core scientific principles, how do we do it recognizing that not everybody responds the same to what's going on in the environment? This is where kind of the skills and the values and the kind of cultural context in which services are provided, in which children are raised, in which families and service providers work together. That's where the devil is in the detail. It's not just a matter of what's the curriculum, even though that also is very important. So let me end with this slide. For those of you who want more information about this, here's the URL for our website. We have lots of material. We have working papers, we have videos, we have briefs that basically are all oriented toward making very complicated science understandable to policymakers and service providers, not dumbing it down, but making it understandable in plain English. So I would invite any of you who'd like more information, please go on our website. And I think I will stop right there and turn it back to you, Denny.
There we go. Oops, there's an echo. Hopefully that will go away. Thank you so much, Dr. Shonkoff. That was extraordinary. And I think what is really so pressing is that we recognize the resiliency and the ability to really build and strengthen some of these, social competency skills, emotion regulation, stress, coping with stress and so forth. We can build that over the lifespan. And so it's not an entirely negative situation where we have toxic stress. There's nothing we can do about it. I think the take home is that there is a lot we can do about it, both in terms of attending to the adverse consequences of stress, but also developing and implementing policies that will reduce the stress in the first place. And I think that's the real burning issue here for policymakers, is what can we do that will be sustainable and that will build systems and structures in our society that will be much more nurturing and more, optimizing it for children to reach their potential. So rather than me blathering, let's ask the audience. Has been so interested. There are so many messages in the chat. Everybody wants your slides. We'll talk about that later. If you will, I would like to ask you a couple of questions from the Q&A. First, to accomplish the goal of developing human capital, should we be investing more in educating the gifted in public schools?
So it's a very interesting question, and the answer, from my perspective, First of all, let me just say science doesn't have an answer for that. That's a value judgment. I would think that from my perspective, we should be doing everything we can to help to optimize the development of all children in our society, which means that for those who are the most gifted, at least we can be identified that way early on. Of course, we should be helping them to stretch. We also should be recognized there are a lot of comparably gifted children who are invisible because of the circumstances in which they're living and the more limited opportunities we provided for them. And then for the general population, because most of us are not gifted, I'm not gifted, most of us are not gifted, but the extent to which we could all be all that we could be that is a win-win strategy for an entire society, right? And so, we should not be pitting one part of the population against another, and recognize that whether it's education or healthcare or anything else, one size fits all is not the recipe for meeting the needs of the population and all the people.
And that's where equity comes in, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I grew up in a community outside of Washington, D.C., where there was tremendous talent and brilliance, but no opportunities. It was a very low income area, and there were no opportunities for kids that really had a good deal of intelligence, but low income.
In fact, Danny, I know I don't want to stop the flow of questions, but this is a very important point that I didn't make earlier. It needs to be made. There is a part of the population, generally about 20% of the population, that genetically is most sensitive to the environment. And in bad environments, these are the kids who are really the most at risk for serious problems in learning and emotional development, mental health, and physical health. But that same population, which is exquisitely sensitive to the environment, it's also in a positive, growth-promoting, secure, stable environment, are on average the more creative part of the population because they are more sensitive to what's going on. And so it answers the question of biology always says, how did something like that survive through evolution? Because if you're so sensitive, it's because these are some of the best and most creative contributors to society we have if they're in a supportive environment. So it works both ways. But most of us are in the middle. We're doing the best we can, and we roll with the punches.
Right. No, that is such an important point. And there are many hidden talents. The work of Bruce Ellis and Megan Gunner and Margaret Sheridan and so forth, hidden talents in these populations that need to blossom and be capitalized on. Okay, so great question. I love this one. And we're going to just stay on for a few more minutes if other people want to stay on. I know many have 1 o'clock meetings, but we'll answer a few more questions. This one is important. Are there states, countries, cities, school districts, et cetera, that have operationalized these policies with fidelity?
Boy, that's a hard question. My simple answer would be, of course there are states and countries that are committed in concept and in principle to this. I think for me, the real challenge for states and countries, communities, however we want to cut it, is how willing are we to kind of invest in figuring out how to get better and better at this, rather than just focus on setting, for those who are interested in investing in early childhood, set a kind of modest bar and leave it at that. Because this is to have bigger impacts, to kind of really have things be where we want them to be. This is complicated, right? But we don't run away from complicated problems. There are cancers that are still have very high mortality rates after years and years of research. And not many people are saying, why are we still doing research on pancreatic cancer? I don't understand. So many people, it's because we know we could figure it out if we stick in there. So I think the issue is not whether states or countries are committed. I think the issue is how do we create an environment where we put our energies into figuring out how we can keep doing better, rather than put our energies into just keeping the money going to kind of keep doing just what we've been doing. Because what we do makes a difference. And for many people, it makes a big difference, but we know at a population level, we haven't gotten to the promised land yet. So it's basically raising the bar and recognizing this is a work in progress.
Right. There are so many interesting questions here in the Q&A, and I know we're not going to get to all of them, and we can try to follow up afterwards since we'll have a record of this. One comes from Cyantan. I'm sure I messed that up. Early childhood is increasingly getting more attention across diverse sectors and players. While it's great news for the field, in developing countries like India, this nascent field is a fertile hunting ground for extractive ed tech startups or manipulative, unscientific policies. How to regulate, democratize this nascent space till there is more awareness and activism from our most vulnerable communities.
Wow, that's a good
mouthful. Yeah.
Our webinar into itself. Here's the way I would respond to that. I think one of the things that we've learned. So here's another COVID-19 lesson, right? Number one is science often doesn't have all of the answers, but we desperately need the best thinking of science, wherever it is, and we can watch the frontiers move. Okay. Second is, and this is the more important thing responding to this question, very provocative question, science by itself is not enough. Science has to converge with the lived experiences of the people whose lives and whose children we're focusing on. And this is a co-created process. This is not, and raising children and promoting health is actually on the ground. It's much more a bungling art than it is a precise science, right? All of us know that. The best parents do a dozen things wrong every day. This is not, but science has tremendous power to help us think about what do we know about what can be more helpful, how do we know about what undermines development, and then that needs to be combined with on-the-ground experience of people who work in programs and the lived experiences of families raising children, and together be protected from what will always be the threat of people who want to come in and exploit a situation like this. Quite frankly, I don't know. The answer to me is not the latest app, but on the other hand, we need technology thinking here as well. We need as many lenses, as many minds table as possible. And this is where the issue of racial, ethnic, and a variety of other diversities in terms of life experience is so critical. Okay? This requires creativity and determination, and science can play a very important role, but it's not going to have all the answers by itself.
Public and political will is absolutely essential.
I think science may even be more valuable to help us know some of the things that we may be doing that are wrong or that we know can be harmful.
Right. I'm just going to ask you one more because it's fast and I know the asker. Is there one policy that would be the best starting point?
Oh God. So a couple of responses. One is the best policy to start with is the one that is grounded in good knowledge on the ground in science that's possible to enact where you live. So the best policy that is a non-starter where you live is not the place to start. It's a place to hopefully get to. So there's no one best policy. But I would say if you wanted a bumper sticker answer to that, I would say, and it's repeating what I said in one of my slides, if we want to dramatically improve the life prospects for children facing adversity, we need to focus on helping the adults who are caring for them to turn their lives around based on what they are hoping to do for themselves, because that is the best way to assure the kind of environment in which healthy development takes place. So it's not just about doing magical things with the kids. It's understanding that healthy development unfolds in an environment of supportive relationships, which occur in a community that provides what families need to raise their children, in a society that understands that its job is not to raise children, but to help to promote the kind of environment in which people who care for children can do what they want to do, which is to create a very bright future for their children. So it's those principles that really should be a big tent framework for thinking about how, a lot of people, I think people see early childhood as a big tent issue as it is. It's really spread across the political spectrum, but the issue is, what do we do about that? maybe the last thing I should say, something I've learned from the business community, because we can't just kind of scoff at questions about who's going to pay for it. Of course we have to answer that question. Of course we do. But what I've learned from the business community, I wish I'd learned it earlier in my life when I had more brain plasticity, is that so cost is an important thing to think about. But from a business and investment perspective, it's not so much cost, it's return on investment. So something that costs relatively little and doesn't accomplish very much is awfully expensive. Something that costs more, that produces a much bigger impact, that returns societal benefits and financial returns, that's not expensive. That's a smart investment. So it's not a matter of just throwing money at things, but it's a matter of when people say, how do we do this on the simple and cheap, and can we just do something easy? Yeah, you can do that. We do that a lot, but that's not necessarily the way you're going to get a really big impact, which is what we all need. And that's the real value issue.
Right. That is a great closing remark, and it really just wraps everything up in a bow. I will also point to the WHO report from 2019 in that regard, Dr. Shonkoff, that showed for $748 billion a year in lost cost and productivity due to ACEs alone every year in this country. 748 billion lost in cost of productivity.
So Denny, I know we're way over, but let me leave you with one thing. If ACEs is going to be part of the final message, I want to bring everybody back to an early point in my presentation that is rock solid in the scientific community, is that ACEs and your number on an ACE scale is a population level probability factor. It is not something that says anything about a specific child. Right. There are lots of kids whose families have high ACE scores who are going to do really well. And there are kids in families with ACE scores of 0 who are going to have problems. So from a policy perspective, we really need to pay attention to ACEs and how different parts of the population are differentially affected. But when it comes down to individual programming, an ACE score does not tell us anything about an individual child, because that's about differential sensitivity to the
right. That is such an important point. Not only, for policy and for researchers, right? Researchers, it's a lesson to be learned, because it's very important for the interpretation of our results and how that's utilized by the public and policymakers. So very important point. This has been a remarkable briefing, Dr. Shonkoff. I thank you so much. You will see later in the comments just many remarks about how important this talk was and how much appreciated it was. So we
thank you for giving me the opportunity, and thank you to all of you who are still on the Zoom.
Yep, there are quite a few that have hung in there. So yes, we will follow up. Thank you so much. You take very good care, everybody.
Take care. Bye-bye.